Over 2 years ago, in the video How Can Liberty Win?, I explained that winning is a day-by-day endeavor because liberty is not on the side of entropy. Misery and totalitarianism are on the side of entropy, just like misery is in everything else. For instance, you wash up your car with the full knowledge that more dust will pile up in a very short while. But you do it anyway because a cleaned up car is preferable to a dirty one. With this realization in mind, there are a few consequences. One of those consequences is that the forces of the non-left will almost always be understaffed in some departments. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so this is something that's been on my mind for several months now, and one of the patrons of this channel also requested that I speak to the issue. Now, as you know, I always deliver on requests, even though it can sometimes take several months until I do so. As usual, what I'm about to say comes from the understanding that I don't have all the answers and I don't know everything, which is why the comment section is open. So with that in mind, I'm going to try to explain why the forces of the non-left are and will continue to be understaffed, why this matters, how can we change some of this, and what are and will be the main obstacles. So let's start with the activities in which the forces of the non-left are understaffed. Well, this one is not hard, isn't it? There are fewer non-leftist actors than there are leftist ones, and this holds true for every arts-related field, with the possible exception of video games, but I won't get into that. There are also fewer non-leftist activists than there are leftists, though some would argue that this is not the case in the United States. More on that later in the video. There are also fewer non-leftist apparatchiks than there are leftist ones. Heck, even the very word apparatchik comes from the old Soviet Union, and it is the pinnacle of the institutional left in every single country, past and present, regardless of culture, race, creed, time zone, or anything else really. And this has been true throughout history, mind you. Can you tell what were Clark Gable's politics in the 1930s? Or Shirley Temple's, or Wallace Beery's in 1910? You can't, but it's a safe bet they weren't conservatives. Yet if you watch or listen to their work today, they definitely don't sound like militant leftists, neither by today's standards nor by the standards of their time. Now why is that? Well, nobody knows the full answer, but part of the answer lies in the fact that most of the surrounding was distinctly not leftist. And, very important to mention, the surrounding was also influential. This latter part is no longer true today. In the 1920s, the surrounding served as muses for the scriptwriters and directors and all of the other individuals involved in art creation. The directors sought to depict the reality observed around them and, in some cases, sing praises to that reality. That's increasingly not the case today, as art became more fiction and art institutions have become more averse than ever to anything traditional, even by their own standards. Now, can you imagine a show like, let's say, Married with Children being broadcasted today? Yeah, me neither. Yet for its time, that show was very traditional by the very standards of the community that produced it, even as it was provocative for the wider society. Now, okay, but you can say that the arts have always been weird, after all. So it shouldn't be an enormous surprise that there is a shortage of normal people in the artistic communities. I mean, after all, the artists were weird in the 17th century as well, or the 10th century, or really in almost any other period when such thing as an artistic community could exist. Alright, but how about activists? This is where things have gone really wrong, because for most of the time, till about 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, activist was a politically neutral term, as one could easily identify activists for a whole plethora of causes from all over the political spectrum. But that is no longer the case today. In the current year, activist is almost entirely synonymous not just with leftist, but far leftist causes. The only mainstream exception would be pro-life activists, and there are a few non-mainstream exceptions too. But for the vast majority of instances, activism is regarded as a left-wing phenomenon. And to make things worse, a saddening chunk of the non-leftist sector has accepted this designation. I know I get to struggle with quote-unquote my side too once in a while, because I'm a proponent of activist tactics for the purposes of furthering liberty. And this is not entirely by accident. When virtually all figures of authority tells you from a very young age that disagreeing with an ever-increasing totalitarian leftist orthodoxy is basically a crime, it's not a surprise that whatever activist instinct one might have is thoroughly suppressed and the non-leftist individual becomes, well, demoralized. And finally, there's the issue of apparatchiks. Here, the non-leftist sector is inherently at a disadvantage and has been since forever, and I contend it will continue to be. The main reason is basically because non-leftists tend to go into the private sector because that's where the money is. Nobody, except ideological leftists, dream about being an Office of Civil Rights enforcer, or a member of the EPA, or a consultant for the European Parliament, or a diversity officer for the Bundespolizei, that is the German Federal Police, or a policy officer for the Diskrimineringsombudsmannen in Sweden. If anything, most of these institutions and positions shouldn't even exist in the first place, let alone aspire to take a position inside them. Now, the good news is that we don't have to be that numerous in this particular sector, at least not over the long run. But over the short run, the existence of apparatchiks and their overwhelming ideological uniformity is and will be one of the main obstacles on the road from present-day insanity towards mental sanity. Alright, so far I have said nothing controversial, or new for that matter. The controversial part lies in how to change some of these things, and it's controversial because, well, nobody will like the answer. And by nobody, I mean the vast majority of the network of pundits, opinionators, analysts, and, yes, religious dogmatists. I laid out part of the answer over a year ago in December 2016 in the video called The Deep State, which is another topic you've heard first here and then on the mainstream media. Now in that video, I said we need to aim to build our own deep state with the purpose of maintaining whatever victories we secure now and in the future. Because without such a deep state, we'll be back to square one much faster than we'd want to. Sadly, this approach, albeit the most efficient, is also the least popular and the least handy. And one of the main reasons is because we're not like that. We're not really that good at boycotts, let alone at deep state mentality. There are very few of us who consciously choose to deny employment to leftists, or deny business, or deny help. As a general rule, non-leftists are live and let live kind of people, which is generally a great characteristic, but not when you're in war. And this is the part we need to change about ourselves. We need to bring a much bigger sense of emergency and urgency amongst our troops. Unlike the 1950s or even the 1990s, we're no longer in the realm of disputes about policy. We're in the realm of war for the very soul of our civilization. Our political opponents don't just disagree on how should the tax code be structured, or whether the church should be more or less revered, or whether it's okay to have 4% of the GDP for the military or 1.5% is enough. No. Our political opponents disagree with our very right to exist. And this is something we need to get through our thick skulls, mine included. We can debate with liberals, we can debate with most religious conservatives, we can even debate with some social democrats, though I would strongly argue against that. But we can't debate against the unholy coalition of leftists and Islamists. You don't debate with these people because there is nothing to debate. So, what can be done? Well, for starters, try being more supportive of activists for liberty causes. One of the biggest hurdles of non-leftist activists face is lack of support and oftentimes outright hostility from their own side. I cringe every time when I see so-called conservatives being hostile to anti-feminist activists, even while they acknowledge that feminism is cancer. Do you think feminism will just go away because you and your fellow National Review reading friends know that? I mean, seriously, if you're not into anti-feminism, then at the very least you could abstain from providing additional hostility to those who are. They already have to face the outright violence from the far left. Why pile up on it too? With some liberty causes for which there are activists a lack of support would be a step forward, quite frankly. Secondly, do befriend apparatchiks. And no, I'm not joking. It's astonishing to me how many people from the non-left have zero acquaintances in any bureaucracy. How do you expect to wield influence if you don't know anybody from the inside? I'm not going to suggest you become an apparatchik yourself, mainly because I don't suggest things that I know for a fact I could never do myself, though if you can do that, it's even better. But befriending people from inside the bureaucracies is something everyone can do, especially in the local bureaucracies, which, as I explained in many other practical politics videos, usually wield the highest amount of power. And that's true even in centralized states. The reason for this is because most apparatchiks are just regular people. Some of them are militant ideologues for whom, in my darkest moments, I would argue human rights should not apply, but most of them are really not like that. So befriending an apparatchik comes with a lot of benefits both for yourself and our ideas in general. Simply knowing a few bureaucrats and slowly working towards convincing them of at least some of our ideas come in very handy when I started working towards crushing the rent control movement in my hometown, for instance. Just saying. Of course, that's one example, but in general, having a constant stream of information from inside the bureaucracies is the kind of asset that we on the non-left have failed to acquire most of the time, and that has got to change. Thirdly, and finally, we need to become more militant where it matters. As a general rule, in the last 10 years, the non-left has become far more militant than it has been in the previous 70 years. And that is good. However, this has lacked focus in many cases. Now, this hasn't been very noticeable because the left has lost focus too. I mean, just the other day, CNN's headline was "Why Kids Love Fascist Cartoons Like Pew Patrol and Thomas." That is an example of lack of focus. So as long as they are severely unfocused, our own occasional lack of focus won't be a huge issue. But this status quo will not last. Sooner than many dare to imagine, the left will get back to its focus. Sure, it will take them another several years, but they'll get back in shape. This time window should be used to sharpen our own focus. For instance, when moving into a new place and you have options for utilities, which is increasingly the case nowadays, make sure you ask potential companies about who did they endorse, if they endorse anyone, in the last mayoral race, or presidential, or parliamentary. You get the drift. If you're a small business owner, do you know the political leanings of your employees? And if not, why not? Why provide employment potentially to an enemy of civilization? When taking a cab, you can look up if that company engaged in anti-Uber protests. If they did, take another cab from another company. If you find out post factum, make sure you leave them a crappy review for their anti-capitalist practices. Now, of course, you can't do this all the time. In some instances, it's not even possible. But in most instances, it is possible. And in medium-sized cities, let's say cities between 300,000 and 1 million inhabitants, if 5,000 people do this, that's enough to project a consensus. If 5,000 people leave a negative review to a company in a single city because it has too many leftists or too much of a far-left messaging or advertising, that, my fellow deplorables, makes a difference. For reference to this, do look up Lidl Removes Crosses campaign, in which the German cuckolded chain Lidl removed some crosses from its Greek food packaging that depicted some Greek churches. The backlash was so well deployed that it forced The Guardian to take the side of the consumers and the side of the cross. Now that is no small thing. The next step should be aggressive lobbying to get Lidl to employ more conservatives for cultural sensitivity, of course. Does it sound exaggerated? Well, yeah, because it is. But I didn't write the book of rules. The left did. I'm just arguing that we follow the exact same playbook, starting with forcing them to live up by their own rulebook. Now, subversion will not be done in 1 day or 1 year. Maybe in 1 decade we can have some strong results, but it will only happen if the non-left starts engaging this in a conscious and concentrated way. If we don't, then we have no reason to complain. The enemy is not at the gates, it is already within. And doing nothing isn't going to solve the issue in our favor. Being civilized when dealing with barbarians is a safe way to lose. Lose with honor, of course, but lose nonetheless. Now, the next video on practical politics, which will come much sooner than you expect, will be a playbook on how to subvert small NGOs that have a big voice. You'll be surprised how easy it is to follow the rules. But until then, I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, depending on when I'll have this video published. And I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.